Hello, this is Dave from the Wizard's Keep in Muncie, Indiana. And today I wanted to talk to you about some of my favorite board games, or I think the best board games I would recommend to somebody coming from a role-playing background. When I got into tabletop games initially, I started off playing role-playing games like Dungeons and Dragons and Vampire the Masquerade. And so I thought I would come up with a list of games I would recommend to players that had come from a similar background, or coming from board games from RPGs. And I kind of rank these games not necessarily as my favorite game, or these are not like in order of my favorite games or games I think have the best mechanics in order, but more in like what games I think would be most likely to appeal to an RPG player. So the number 1 game would be the best game for an RPG player, and the number 10 game, I guess, would be the least, but it's still on this list, so it's still pretty good. And to start off with number 10, we're going to go with Call to Adventure. Now, Call to Adventure is a game where you're kind of collecting different cards, and these cards are going to kind of build your character's story. Like, you may start off as a farmer, a peasant, or maybe a novice in a monastery, or maybe in a wizard's apprentice. But you're going to collect different cards, which are going to get kind of like a little bit of an engine building, because as you collect those cards, they're going to give you different attributes, which makes your character better, and therefore you can kind of get even better cards, or maybe succeed at, or better or more difficult challenges, which are going to give you more victory points. Because in the end, victory points is what matters in this game. Whoever gets the most victory points wins. But the cool factor of it is just the story you build by the cards you acquire. Like, you may start off as something minor, as you'd expect, like a low-level RPG. You might fight some goblins, or maybe you defeat a cut purse. But eventually, maybe you go through and now you're suddenly become the master of the Thieves Guild, or you defeat the Archmage to replace him in the Tower of High Sorcery, or whatever it may be. But the other cool thing is you've got these basically 2-sided dice, which is kind of casting the runes, and to how you beat your challenges or achieve a certain difficulty. Like, a challenge will have a difficulty number, and that's how many successes you need to get. In order to get those successes, you're casting the runes, which is sort of effectively like rolling 2-sided dice, which I thought had a nice flavor to it, because it's sort of like you're a fortune teller, telling your story or predicting your story if it's going to be successful or not by the runes that you cast. And I thought that was really cool. And this game does a really good job. I mean, I always wanted to kind of maybe play an RPG where maybe I played this game first, built a character story based on this game, and then later played an RPG with the story of that character. And that's Call to Adventure. My number 9 game, also kind of in a similar vein, of where I wanted to build a character with this game and then later played in an RPG, and that is roleplay. Now, as you would imagine, why this game is good for RPG players is the RPG players are going to quickly recognize the theme of this game. What you're doing in this game is it's a dice drafting, dice management game where you're kind of manipulating dice and trying to solve this puzzle, figure out this puzzle of where you're placing dice on your board or your character sheet. And what you're doing is building a role-playing character as a game. So it's going to be all 6-sided dice. As you know, in Dungeons and Dragons, you've got 6 attributes. So strength, dexterity, constitution, intelligence, wisdom, charisma. And when you make a traditional D&D character, you roll 3 6-sided dice and kind of allocate those stats. Well, that's what you're doing in Role Player, except you're usually drafting 1 die at a time and placing them in the different locations. So you might place them in the charisma spot or place them in an intelligence spot. And eventually the game ends after you have placed all of your 6 die, or 3 dice in each of the 6 attributes, which then you total up those attributes to see what you have. Like, if you have an 18 in strength or a 16 in wisdom. And depending on which characters you draft at the beginning of the game, depending if you're a wizard, or if you're a fighter or a rogue, it's going to, or if you're chaotic evil or lawful good, because you also have an alignment, and some of the cards you draft are going to shift your alignment in different directions. The different skills you acquire depending on how noble or dishonorable those skills are going to shift your alignment. And based on what your alignment goal is, you're going to get different victory points for that. So getting the certain attributes and within certain parameters gives you victory points. The alignment that you're supposed to get gives you victory points. You collect different equipment, which is like a set collection, and then based on the matching equipment you get, gives you different victory points. So it's really kind of this point salad game where you're just getting different victory points from different sources, and you're kind of trying to figure out the puzzle of which is the most efficient way to get those points. But in the end, you have a stats of a fully playable, or at least basically a concept of like a Dungeons and Dragons character. So somebody who comes from Dungeons and Dragons is going to quickly get the concept of this game. And in itself, it's a great puzzle game as well, and that's Role Player. Now, the rest of these games I feel are great for, like those first two, Call to Adventure and Role Player, are mostly the theme of them will really capture the attention of somebody from an RPG background. Either the Call to Adventure basically telling the backstory of a character, or Role Player kind of the meta game of that building those stats of a character. The rest of these games, I think, really kind of capture the essence of RPG or role-playing games from a story perspective. And so these are all kind of just some of the best games best board games that tell a story or generate a story like you would expect in an RPG. And number 8 on the list is Stuffed Fables. And Stuffed Fables, you're playing the role of stuffed animals, and you're kind of in charge of protecting your child and on the different and all the different adventures these stuffed fables are going to go on while your child is asleep. But you're trying to protect the child while it's asleep from the boogeyman that's hide in the closet or the monsters under the bed. And so you're kind of the valiant teddy bear or the stuffed elephant, and you go on these different adventures. So it's very kind of cute, a great game for the family. And it just tells an interesting story. It's almost like an RPG of these stuffed animals going on these different adventures. And it has a series of interconnected storylines, and that's what I like about Stuffed Fables. My number 7th game is Pathfinder, the adventure card game. Now, those who have watched some of my older videos, especially a couple years ago when I counted down my list of my top 60 favorite games of all time, will know that the Pathfinder adventure card game was my number 1 favorite game of all time. And why is it not so high on this list? Well, the reason being, once again, it's not necessarily by my favorite games, but I think it's going to appeal the most to RPG players. This, because one of the reasons this game is one of my favorite games of all time is also the deck building aspect of the game or the card management aspect of the game. But why I feel that it will appeal to RPG players, but why it's a little higher on this list as opposed to some of the other games coming up, is the story is a little more abstract. Now, RPG players are going to like this game because in this game, you're playing a different RPG character. Pathfinder is a fantasy role-playing game. It's a spin-off of Dungeons and Dragons. So you're going to play either like a fighter or a wizard or a rogue or a cleric like you would imagine in Dungeons and Dragons. But in this game, if you're playing like a wizard character, that's going to determine what cards you add to your deck. So a wizard character is going to have more spell cards. Fighter characters have more weapon cards and more armor cards. And over the course of a series of games, you're going to acquire better weapons and better spell cards that you're going to add to your deck, and therefore you'll jettison the weaker spell cards or the weaker weapon cards, which kind of emulates leveling up your character as you level up your deck. And it does have a storyline that you follow, but the story's a little more abstract, but it's still an excellent game, and I think a lot of RPG players or CCG players and RPG players will really like. And that is the Pathfinder adventure card game. The number 6 game on my list is Descent. Now, Descent can be played two different ways. One, you can play it with a game master, and then basically it's like a one versus all, where one player plays like a game master or an overlord, I believe it's called, and then the other players will play different characters. And they're going through a dungeon, just basically a basic dungeon crawl, except the overlord or the game master in this case is trying to win the game. They control all the monsters and they're trying to defeat the players. Some Dungeons and Dragons games could be played that way as well, but that's not necessarily my favorite way to play. But Descent is kind of designed that way, where the game master is trying to kill the players. Or it can be played a second way where you use an app, and the app plays the role as the game master, and then everybody else plays against the app, and that way it becomes 100% a cooperative game. And that's my favorite way to play Descent. But it does an excellent job of a classic dungeon crawl game where you're kind of fighting monsters, level up your character, and there's a series of connected storylines that you follow through. And it does a really good job of kind of simulating or emulating a dungeon crawl of an RPG. My number 5 favorite game on this list, or what I would recommend to RPG players, is Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. Now this one's a weird one because I always kind of waffle with this one. Is this even a game at all? It's kind of like a super elaborate choose-your-own-adventure book, if you're kind of familiar with those classic old books. But whereas in a choose-your-own-adventure book, at the end of the page it will tell you, it's like if you want to do option A, turn to page 43, or if you want to do option B, turn to page 12. Well, this sort of like this, it's a Sherlock Holmes Victorian-themed mystery, or a series of mysteries, except at the end of the page, it doesn't tell you where to go. Instead, you have to kind of figure that out yourself, either by looking through clues in like different newspapers that you provide, just different clues in the story that you've read so far, looking at maps, looking through a directory and almost like a phone book or map directory where you can kind of see different businesses or different locations around town, and that directory will tell you different corresponding pages, so you can go to those different pages in the case book, and it will tell you another paragraph that might give you some more information, or it might be a red herring. At the end of the case, or when you feel comfortable, you've generate enough clue or learn enough clues, you can go to the end of the case book to solve the case. And that's where they kind of try to add some game mechanics, because inherently Sherlock Holmes has kind of solved this case as well by going to X number of locations. And you're trying to solve the case by going to less locations than Sherlock Holmes went to, or you get different points based on different questions you're able to answer. But in the end, what I really like about it is just reading this interactive story and kind of deducing the puzzle and solving the puzzle. Why I think it appeals to RPG players is because each case has this deep, engrossing story to it, which is what attracted me to this game originally, and that's why I recommended it to RPG players. My number 4 favorite game to recommend to RPG players, which will be familiar to those that saw my list I came out with a week ago of top 10 games to recommend at Halloween time, and that is Betrayal, House on the Hill. And I wanted to kind of add it to this. It just kind of felt like it belonged in this list still. Because 1, it's one of my favorite games of all time. And then 2, because it's another excellent game for RPG players. And the reason being is it almost feels like a dungeon crawl, because as you go through and build the Haunted Mansion, you're laying out different tiles and building the house as you go, which kind of emulates or simulates a dungeon crawl. Plus, as you go through, you're kind of leveling up and get your characters, you're getting different items. And also, there's a story to be told. Because as you build the house, each tile you lay out before you is going to have a symbol on it. And it either spawns an event that triggers an event that happens in the room. You might find an item, or you might discover an omen, which usually ends up being like a super item for your character. But also, you make a die roll. If you roll less than the number of omen cards drawn by all the players, then you trigger the haunt. And what that means is at the beginning of the game, everybody's kind of working together. It's sort of a cooperative game. You're not working against each other as you explore the house. But as you trigger the haunt, one of the players is going to become a traitor. And at that point, you usually take a break from the game. The traitor goes into the other room, reads from the traitor book, and it tells them what they're trying to do to win the game, what scenario you're playing. And then the heroes are in the other room reading what they need to try to do to win the game, what scenario they're playing. And it has like 50 different scenarios in the game, and each one with a cool, neat little story. And that's why it's a great game and a great game for RPG players. My number 3 favorite game for RPG players, or just people who like games that have a deep story to them, is time stories. Now, time stories generically, or at least they kind of abstractly, is a concept that you're part of an organization from the future that's going and traveling through time to basically kind of fix problems or solve problems, sort of like Quantum Leap or Sliders, if you're familiar with those old TV shows. But then each game you play is going to be a different module, a different scenario. And that's why the RPG players are going to be able to identify with this quickly, is because one scenario you might be going back into the past and playing some sort of like Lovecraftian game where you're mixing it up with tentacle monsters from the 1920s. Another game you might be in a modern day setting where you're fighting like a zombie apocalypse. And depending on which scenario or which module or expansion you're playing with, it is like a self-contained role-playing story. And what you're doing is, when you play time stories, as you go back in time, you're going to go back through this area or play through a game multiple times because you only have so much time. You have time units, and when you run out of time units, you're kind of sucked back to your character's present. And so the first time you go through, you're probably not going to solve the mystery or solve the case. You're just kind of trying to pick up as many clues as possible, eliminate as many dead ends as possible. So the next time you go through, okay, let's not go down this hallway, or let's not go investigate this building, let's go here instead. So you're not wasting time units doing those other actions. So eventually you can kind of solve the case. And depending on how many times it takes you to solve the case, you get different victory points for the end of the game. But it's sort of like Sherlock Holmes Consulting Detective. For me, it's not even about winning this game. It's just about immersing myself into the story like an RPG and experiencing the story, and that's the fun of time stories for me. My number 2 favorite game also was on my Halloween list, but Betrayal House on the Hill was higher on that list, so this is kind of an example of what I mean. Betrayal House on the Hill was a better Halloween game in my opinion, but Mansions of Madness is a better game for RPG players. And my last repeat between those two lists. And the reason it's a better game for RPG players because it feels more like an RPG. This one, this is the second edition. The first edition was kind of modeled after Descent, where one player played a game master trying to defeat the other players. The second edition, it only plays with an app. And because of the success and how great of a job they did with this second edition is why they developed the app for Descent as well. But why this game is such great for RPG players is it's a cooperative game where the app basically is the game master. And everybody else plays a character going through what is effectively a role-playing game. Each scenario has an in-depth storyline, which you would imagine from a Lovecraftian setting. And though there's really no leveling up of your characters, you can acquire different items over the course of a scenario, but it's really the goal, or what I really like about this, is you're kind of playing an adventure. You're going through some sort of a mansion, or you might be going through some sort of Lovecraftian setting. You might be in Innsmouth, or you might be in Arkham. And that's what I really like about Mansions of Madness and why it's a great game for RPG players, because it basically is a role-playing game in a box. And now my number 1 game, or what I would recommend to RPG players, and it really couldn't be anything else, and that is Gloomhaven. Gloomhaven is essentially a giant D&D game in a very giant box. It might be multiple D&D games in a box because you're over the course of the game you're going to play and retire different characters. But it's a giant cooperative game where everybody's going to play a different character in it, what effective is a D&D party. Like the game is the game master, and you go through different scenarios, get different treasure items, get different experience points, spend those experience points like you would in an RPG, and going through numerous and numerous scenarios. This is a game that when you play it, it takes as long as what a D&D campaign. You could play this maybe years, but at least over a year or more to complete the entire game. And that's why if somebody who is a RPG player that really wants to play like these really long term D&D games or is really going to enjoy playing Gloomhaven. Maybe they're in an RPG group where somebody is burnt out on being a game master. They could always argue who's going to be the game master, but they really want to play D&D. They can play Gloomhaven, and it basically is, they don't have to argue. The Gloomhaven will be their game master, and they each can play through it. And that is why Gloomhaven is my number 1 game I would recommend for an RPG player. Well, I hope you liked this list. And as always, if you had any questions about any of these games or any other games in general, RPGs or board games, feel free to stop in the Wizard's Keep sometime or message me on Facebook or comment here on YouTube, and I'll feel free or do the best I can to answer your questions. Until next time, thank you for watching.